The geopolitical landscape is shifting dramatically this January. From the streets of Tehran to the halls of Davos, from the Persian Gulf to the corridors of power in Washington, a crisis is unfolding that could reshape the Middle East. I'm Nora Blake, and you're watching Nora Blake. Before we dive into this critical analysis, if you value independent geopolitical reporting, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Your support helps us bring you verified, in-depth coverage of the events shaping our world. Now let's examine what's really happening. Iran faces its most serious domestic crisis in years. The Islamic Republic's brutal crackdown on nationwide protests has left thousands dead and drawn international condemnation. Meanwhile, military assets are moving into position across the region. Airlines are canceling flights. Diplomatic tensions are at breaking point. This isn't just another Middle East crisis. This is a potential inflection point for the entire region, and the decisions made in the coming days could have consequences that echo for decades. It started quietly. On December 28, 2025, shop owners in Tehran's historic Grand Bazaar began closing their doors in protest. What began as strikes over economic hardship quickly transformed into something far more significant. Within days, demonstrations had spread across all 31 Iranian provinces. The protesters weren't just demanding economic relief anymore. They were calling for fundamental change, for the end of the Islamic Republic itself. By early January, security forces responded with overwhelming force, using live ammunition, tear gas, and mass arrests to suppress the demonstrations. The regime imposed a near-total internet blackout, cutting Iran off from the outside world and making it nearly impossible to verify the full scale of what was happening. But fragments of information continued to leak out, painting a horrifying picture. Medical professionals risked their lives to document casualties. Human rights activists worked through underground channels to gather data. And slowly, the world began to understand the magnitude of the violence unleashed by the Iranian regime against its own citizens. How many people died? That's the question that haunts this crisis, and the answer remains deeply contested. The Iranian government claimed that over 3,000 people were killed, blaming the violence on what they called rioters, backed by the United States and Israel. But independent observers paint a far darker picture. The Sunday Times reported estimates from Iranian doctors suggesting 16,500 to 18,000 deaths, based on hospital data gathered through smuggled satellite communications. Time magazine published even more staggering figures, with senior health ministry officials estimating that as many as 30,000 people could have been killed on January 8th and 9th alone. These aren't just numbers. Each represents a life cut short, a family shattered, a future stolen. The scale of the killing, if the higher estimates prove accurate, would rank among the deadliest crackdowns in modern Middle Eastern history. Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei himself acknowledged that several thousands had been killed, though he blamed foreign enemies for the bloodshed. Thousands of miles away in the Swiss Alps, the World Economic Forum in Davos became an unlikely battleground in this crisis. On January 22nd, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky took the stage and delivered a pointed criticism of Iran's crackdown. His words were direct and unsparing. Zelensky stated that the protests in Iran had drowned in blood and that the world had not helped the Iranian people enough. He noted the timing, how European politicians were on holiday when the protests began. By the time they returned to work and started forming positions, Zelensky said the Ayatollah had already killed thousands. Then came his most provocative statement. If the regime survives after this bloodshed, Zelensky warned, it sends a clear signal to every bully. Kill enough people, and you stay in power. For Zelensky, this wasn't abstract moralizing. Ukraine has been fighting Russian aggression for nearly 4 years, and Iran has been one of Russia's most crucial suppliers of weapons and technology used against Ukrainian cities. The Iranian regime's reaction was swift and scathing. Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi launched what news outlets described as a furious tirade against Zelensky, calling him a confused clown and accusing the Ukrainian leader of rinsing American and European taxpayers to fill the pockets of his corrupt generals. The personal attacks didn't stop there. Araghchi declared that the world had had enough of confused clowns, and claimed that unlike Ukraine's foreign-backed military, Iranians knew how to defend themselves without begging for foreign help. The irony in these statements is striking. Iran has sought extensive military cooperation with Russia, including air defense systems. The very regime claiming self-sufficiency has depended heavily on external partnerships to maintain power. This war of words between Kyiv and Tehran reflects deeper geopolitical alignments. Russia and Iran have grown increasingly close as both face international isolation. Ukraine sees Iran's weakening as potentially beneficial to its own security, given the thousands of Iranian drones that have terrorized Ukrainian cities. To understand why Ukraine cares so deeply about Iran's fate, we need to examine the military relationship between Tehran and Moscow. Since 2022, Iran has supplied Russia with thousands of Shahed 136 combat drones, which Russia has renamed Geran-2. These relatively inexpensive weapons have been used relentlessly to strike Ukrainian infrastructure and cities. The Shahed 136 is a loitering munition with a built-in warhead designed as a one-way attack drone that can strike targets from long range. But Iran didn't just sell drones. Tehran provided the technical expertise, blueprints, and support to help Russia build its own drone manufacturing facility at the Alabuga Special Economic Zone in Tatarstan, with the goal of producing 6,000 drones by mid-2025. The scale of this cooperation goes beyond drones. Iran supplied Russia with ballistic missiles, artillery shells, and hundreds of thousands of rounds of ammunition. Bloomberg reported that Iranian missile sales to Russia totaled $2.7 billion since October 2021, according to Western security officials. Every Shahed drone that hits Kyiv, every Iranian artillery shell fired in Ukraine, represents the direct involvement of Tehran in sustaining Russia's invasion. As protests raged and international pressure mounted, extraordinary reports emerged about the Iranian regime's contingency planning. The Times reported that Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei has prepared an emergency plan to leave Iran if mounting unrest overwhelms security forces and threatens his grip on power. The plan envisions a dramatic scenario. Khamenei, now 86 years old, would depart Tehran alongside a small group of close relatives and senior aides, fewer than 24 people, including his son Mojtaba. Where would they go? Former Israeli intelligence officer Benny Sabti stated that Russia would likely serve as Khamenei's destination, saying Moscow remains the only country willing and able to provide him protection. The contingency planning reportedly reflects lessons drawn from the collapse of Syria's Bashar al-Assad, a close Iranian ally who fled Damascus for Moscow in December 2024. Russia has become a haven for embattled autocrats. Its support for the Iranian regime goes beyond accepting potential refugees. Moscow has remained persistent in backing Tehran throughout this crisis, with reports indicating Russia is supplying weapons and surveillance technology to help Iran manage domestic dissent. The crisis took on new dimensions with the involvement of the United States. President Donald Trump repeatedly threatened military action against Iran over the protest crackdown, warning the regime would pay hell if it killed demonstrators. Trump's warnings were specific and ominous. He referenced preventing mass executions and demanded the violence stop. Behind the scenes, a more complex decision-making process unfolded. Trump was presented with several military options, including strikes on numerous Iranian regime targets, launched from U.S. warships and submarines. On January 15th, there was serious expectation inside the administration and across Middle Eastern capitals that Trump would greenlight strikes. U.S. troops began evacuating from Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar and the Navy's 5th Fleet Base in Bahrain. The Iranian regime was convinced a U.S. attack was imminent and issued a notice closing its airspace. Trump ultimately held off, influenced by warnings from allies like Israel and Saudi Arabia, concerns among top aides about effectiveness, insufficient military hardware in the region, and secret back-channel talks with the Iranians. Even as Trump stepped back from immediate strikes, the U.S. military continued positioning assets for potential action. The USS Abraham Lincoln Carrier Strike Group, which had been in the South China Sea, was ordered to the Middle East and is expected to arrive in the Gulf region in the coming days. A carrier strike group represents enormous military power. It typically includes an aircraft carrier, guided missile cruisers, anti-aircraft warships, and anti-submarine destroyers or frigates. But the Abraham Lincoln is just one component. U.S. officials told media outlets that additional air defenses would be brought to the region, including more Patriot and THAAD anti-missile systems. THAAD systems are specifically designed to intercept ballistic missiles, the exact weapons Iran would use to retaliate against any strikes. There are only about 8 THAAD systems in the world, and they're not moved for drills. Trump himself confirmed the buildup, telling reporters he had a massive naval armada heading toward the Gulf region, describing it as a big force going toward Iran. The message was clear. Military options remain very much on the table. The tension reached commercial aviation. Starting January 23rd, multiple international airlines suspended flights to major Middle East hubs, citing security risks amid rising U.S.-Iran tensions. Air France and Dutch carrier KLM suspended services to Tel Aviv, Dubai, Riyadh, and other destinations. Lufthansa halted Tehran services until March 29th, with Austrian Airlines extending cancellations. Airlines don't make these decisions lightly. Canceling profitable routes costs millions. They act on specific warnings from aviation authorities about threats to civilian aircraft. The European Union's aviation regulator recommended on January 16th that airlines stay out of Iran's airspace as tensions flared. The disruptions affected thousands of passengers and created logistical nightmares for carriers trying to reroute flights that normally transit Iranian and Iraqi airspace. The airline cancellations serve as a barometer of perceived risk. When major carriers simultaneously pull out of a region, it signals they've received credible warnings about potential military action. Another player entered the crisis with a stark warning. On January 24th, Turkish Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan stated publicly that there were signs Israel was seeking an opportunity to attack Iran. In an interview with Turkish broadcaster NTV, Fidan said he hoped Israel would find a different path. But the reality was that Israel in particular was looking for an opportunity to strike Iran. Fidan's assessment was based on direct intelligence and diplomatic contacts. He revealed he had conveyed these concerns directly to Iranian officials during a recent visit to Tehran, telling them as their friend that bitter truths needed to be spoken. Why would Israel seek to strike Iran now? The timing could be strategic. With Iran's regime weakened by domestic unrest and international pressure, Israel might see an opportunity to degrade Iranian nuclear capabilities or military infrastructure with reduced risk of effective retaliation. Israel previously launched Operation Rising Lion in June 2025, striking Iranian nuclear and ballistic missile sites and killing IRGC commander Hossein Salami, along with senior officers. Turkey's public warning suggests Ankara is trying to deter Israeli action while maintaining relationships with both Tehran and Western powers. A delicate balancing act that reflects Turkey's complex regional position. This crisis doesn't exist in isolation. It's part of a broader realignment in the Middle East. Iran's regime, already weakened by economic sanctions and the 2025 conflict with Israel, now faces the most serious internal challenge to its authority in years. The outcome will ripple across the region. For Israel, a weakened Iran means reduced threats from proxy forces like Hezbollah and the potential degradation of Iran's nuclear program through internal collapse rather than military strikes. For Saudi Arabia and Gulf states, Iran's instability presents both opportunities and risks. They've long opposed Iranian regional influence, but fear chaos could spread. For Russia, losing its Iranian partner would be a strategic blow, eliminating a crucial source of weapons and regional leverage. For the United States, the situation presents a classic dilemma. Supporting regime change aligns with democracy promotion, but risks creating a power vacuum or triggering wider conflict. The protesters in Iran aren't asking for American intervention. They're demanding their own government listen to their grievances. How external powers respond to their struggle will help determine not just Iran's future, but the broader trajectory of Middle Eastern geopolitics. The question isn't whether Iran will change. The question is how and at what cost. Throughout this crisis, information itself has been weaponized. Iran's near total internet shutdown, now lasting over 2 weeks in some areas, represents one of the most comprehensive communications blackouts in modern history. The regime understands that maintaining control requires controlling the narrative. Activist groups inside Iran have risked their lives to compile death tolls, smuggling data out through underground channels and satellite communications. Medical professionals have documented casualties under threat of arrest. Families have been pressured to remain silent about lost loved ones. Meanwhile, competing narratives clash on the international stage. Iranian state media portrays the protesters as foreign-backed rioters and terrorists. Western media emphasizes the regime's brutality and the protesters' demands for freedom. Russian and Chinese state outlets frame the unrest as American meddling. Social media platforms become battlegrounds where videos are shared, verified, debunked, and weaponized. The truth becomes increasingly difficult to discern, buried under layers of propaganda, misinformation, and incomplete evidence. Yet certain facts remain undeniable. Thousands are dead. The Iranian regime used overwhelming force against largely peaceful protesters, and the international community is grappling with how to respond. The immediate future remains uncertain. Trump's decision to hold off on military strikes doesn't mean the option is off the table. The continued movement of U.S. military assets suggests Washington wants to maintain pressure while exploring other options. These could include enhanced sanctions targeting Iranian officials, cyber operations to undermine the regime's control systems, or covert support for opposition groups. Israel's calculus is different. If Turkish intelligence is correct about Israeli intentions, Netanyahu's government may be preparing its own operation, potentially targeting Iran's nuclear facilities or IRGC command structures. An Israeli strike could come with or without U.S. coordination. For Iran's regime, survival depends on completely suppressing the protests while managing international pressure. The playbook they've used before, brutal crackdown followed by normalization, faces unprecedented challenges this time. The scale of killing, the international attention, and the economic devastation make recovery more difficult. The protesters face the harshest calculus of all. Continuing to demonstrate means risking death. Staying home means accepting that thousands died for nothing. The regime is betting that fear will ultimately prevail over courage. Whether that bet pays off will determine Iran's trajectory for years to come. What we're witnessing in Iran is a moment of profound uncertainty, a crisis that could reshape the Middle East or end with the regime's brutal reassertion of control. The death toll, whatever the final verified number proves to be, represents a tragic cost already paid. The geopolitical implications extend far beyond Iran's borders, touching conflicts in Ukraine, regional power balances, and the global order itself. For those of us trying to understand these events, the challenge is separating verified facts from propaganda, understanding the human cost behind the statistics, and recognizing that this isn't just a geopolitical chess game, but a struggle for the future direction of one of the Middle East's most important nations. If you found this analysis valuable, subscribe to Nora Blake for continued coverage as this situation develops. Share this video with others who want to understand what's really happening beyond the headlines. Leave a comment with your thoughts on how this crisis might unfold. The coming days and weeks will be critical. The decisions made now by protesters in Tehran, officials in Washington, commanders in Tel Aviv, and diplomats across the region will echo for years. And one thing is certain: whatever happens next, the Iran that emerges from this crisis will not be the same as the Iran that entered it.